wheelchair had driven off a facilities manager on his first morning, 2 property coordinators before noon of their second week, and a licensed contractor who left his tools in the lobby rather than face a third conversation with her. The building, a converted textile factory on the corner of 3rd and Vine, sat half-renovated, its permits lapsing, her board circling like they already knew something she didn't. Then, Caleb Dorsey walked in, a widowed mechanic from the east side with a rusted pickup and exactly 1 week's rent left in his checking account. He wasn't there because he thought he could handle her. He was there because Maisie needed to eat. What happened in that building over the next 8 months? That is the story I have to tell you. If you believe people can change, drop a heart in the comments and tell me what city you're watching from. The morning Caleb Dorsey showed up at the Cole Properties building on 3rd and Vine, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees, and the radiator in his truck had sprung a slow leak somewhere outside of Norwood. He drove the last 4 miles with the heat off, windows cracked to keep the engine from climbing into the red, and his daughter Maisie curled in the passenger seat with her coat zipped to her chin and his old work jacket laid over her like a blanket. She was 7. She didn't complain. That was the thing about Maisie that undid him. Sometimes. In the evenings when she was asleep and he was sitting at the kitchen table doing the math that never worked out. She was her mother's daughter in that way. Dana had been built from the same quiet endurance, the same economy of complaint. It had taken a brain aneurysm to stop her 19 months ago, and even then Caleb had the irrational, private feeling that Dana had apologized to him on the way out. He shook the thought loose as he pulled into the parking lane on 3rd Street. The building was in front of him, and it did not look like money. That was the first surprise. He'd heard Cole Properties, everybody in Cincinnati had heard Cole Properties, but the name conjured glass towers and valets and men in Italian shoes, making decisions about other people's neighborhoods, from offices with river views. This building was different. 5 stories of old brick the color of dried blood. A freight elevator that someone had walled off with plywood at street level. Scaffolding on the east face that had clearly been standing there long enough to rust at the joints. A sign on the door, Cole Properties, 3rd and Vine renovation project. Below it, in smaller letters in a different font, someone had taped a handwritten addendum. Contractors, ring bell, wait, do not knock. Caleb looked at the sign for a moment. He rang the bell. He waited. The door opened, and a young man in a Cole Properties polo looked at Caleb the way people look at contractors they've been burned by before, professionally, carefully, with the particular hopefulness of someone who had learned to modulate their expectations. His name badge said Theo, and he was probably 26, and he had the eyes of a man who had been fielding complaints for a while. Caleb Dorsey, Caleb said. Hear about the maintenance and renovation coordinator position. Theo visibly relaxed, the way a person does when the thing they've been dreading hasn't shown up yet today. Right, yes, come in. He held the door with the urgency of someone who wanted the transaction completed before something changed. I should tell you, the position is technically active, and the building genuinely needs the work. Ms. Cole conducts the final interview herself. He paused, choosing something. She's very direct. I've worked for direct people. Right. He said it in a way that suggested Caleb might not have the right definition of the word. The lobby was a gutted beauty. Whoever had started the renovation had good taste. The original concrete floors had been polished to a low sheen. The brick was exposed and clean. The ceiling height was probably 22 feet, and someone had roughed in an industrial lighting grid overhead that was going to be stunning when it was finished. But it had stopped there. Wires dangled from junction boxes like afterthoughts. Half the lighting grid was dark. There was a temporary plywood wall dividing the lobby from what was going to be an atrium, and in the gap between the plywood and the original east wall, Caleb could see where water damage had come through around a window frame that somebody had replaced, but not properly sealed. The wrong product for the substrate. It would fail again by spring. He could see the early signs of it from across the room. The slight hairline separation where the sealant had already begun its retreat from the brick edge. He was still looking at the window frame when he heard the elevator. It arrived with a hydraulic sigh. They'd at least installed a new lift mechanism, which was the kind of investment that told you something about priorities, and the doors opened and Renata Cole came into the lobby, and Caleb understood, immediately, why 11 people had quit. She was not cruel in the way of small people. She was too intelligent for that, too interested in efficiency to bother with cruelty for its own sake. What she was, he would come to understand over time, was precise, surgically, exhaustively precise about incompetence, about waste, about the specific failure mode of people who took her money and then treated her condition as a built-in advantage, as something that made her slower and less observant than she was. She was none of those things. She was in a motorized black wheelchair that she handled with the economy of someone who had made it an extension of her own movement, and she came to a stop 6 feet from him with the accuracy of someone who had calibrated that distance deliberately, and she looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. "You're looking at the window frame," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why, it was sealed with the wrong product for that substrate. It'll fail again by spring. You need to strip it and reseal with a polyurethane product and a backer rod. The foam expansion will hold through the freeze-thaw cycle. The way it's done now, the movement in the brick is going to work the joint open every winter." A pause. Brief. Something moved through her expression and was gone before he could name it. "Who taught you that?" 19 years working on buildings. First 8 in a shop, last 11 running my own crew. Your crew. It's just me now. He didn't offer more than that. She studied him with the kind of attention that was not hostile so much as thorough. The way a person examines a piece of equipment they're considering acquiring. Renata Cole was 38, dark hair pulled back from her face with nothing decorative about it, and the kind of bone structure that a photograph would lean toward. Her hands rested on the wheelchair's armrests with a deliberate stillness, not the stillness of someone who was tired, but the stillness of someone who had decided where to put their energy, and this was not the place for display. She wore a tailored black blazer over a dark shirt. No jewelry, no watch, nothing that could catch on a threshold or slow her down. "You had your own crew, and now you don't," she said. "Yes, why?" He could have given her any number of answers that were true and less complete. He gave her the full one, because he was cold and tired, and he had used up his performance reserves on the drive in, and also because he thought, without being able to articulate why, that she would know the difference. "My wife died. I lost some contracts when I took time with my daughter. The business didn't survive the interruption." She looked at him for a moment that was a second longer than her other looks. Not with pity. There was nothing in Renata Cole's expression that resembled pity. For him or, he suspected, for herself, but with something that might have been a form of recognition. "I pay $32 an hour," she said. "This building needs a minimum of 12 weeks of dedicated work to reach certificate of occupancy, and after that there are 7 additional coal properties in various states of deferred maintenance across the city. The previous coordinator lasted 11 days. The one before that lasted 6 weeks, but the last 3 of those weeks involved me obtaining refunds from his vendors because he had been overbilling on materials. I found 4 substitutions he hadn't disclosed. This job requires someone who understands that I track every invoice, that I walk this building 3 times a week on inspection, and that I will know within 24 hours if a material substitution has been made without authorization. Are those conditions you can work under? Yes, you haven't asked what happened to the people who quit. No, that doesn't bother you. I don't quit." She looked at him one moment more, the assessment of someone who has been lied to in exactly this way before and is deciding whether to apply the same weight to the same words again. Then she turned the chair and moved back toward the elevator with a smooth efficiency. "Theo will get you the access codes and the materials inventory. I want your assessment of the water intrusion points on the east wall by Thursday. Every one of them, not just the one you were looking at." The elevator doors closed behind her. Theo appeared at Caleb's shoulder. He was looking at the elevator with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something that contradicts his expectations. That was, "She didn't send you out." That's more than usually happens in a first conversation. "Thursday for the assessment," Caleb said. "I'll need the as-built drawings if you have them. I'll get everything." Theo moved toward the back office with the energy of someone who didn't want to slow down the momentum before it stopped. "You want coffee? We have a machine." Caleb looked up at the lighting grid again, at the wires, at the ceiling height, at the window frame he'd already started solving in his head. After, he said. Show me the materials bay first. He started Thursday. He was in the building by 7:15, before Theo, before the two remaining contract workers who showed up sporadically and worked in the incurious way of men who had long since stopped expecting to be on this site next month. He moved through the building with a flashlight and a legal pad, and he cataloged every point of water intrusion on the east wall. There were 9 of them, ranging from the failed window seal to a flashing failure at the roofline, to 2 places where the brick mortar had been repointed with the wrong mix and was already spalling at the joints. And he added to the list a further 6 structural concerns that were not technically in the scope she'd given him, but that would cost her 3 to 5 times more to address if left until the primary work was done. He left the full report on Theo's desk at 2 in the afternoon. Materials cost breakdown. 3 sourcing tiers. A note that said, I found 6 additional items outside the east wall scope. I've included them because they'll compound. Bill me for my time on them if that's outside what you want. He didn't hear from her that afternoon. At 4:45, he was measuring the plywood partition in the lobby when the elevator opened, and Renata Cole came out with his report in her hand. She stopped at the familiar distance, 6 feet, he noted it, and said, You found 9 intrusion points. The previous contractor found 3. There were 9. Why did you include the additional 6 structural items? Because someone should. She looked at him with the particular quality she brought to things that didn't follow the expected shape. I could argue you're trying to expand your contract scope. You could, but you said you track every invoice, which means you'll know what those 6 items cost now versus what they cost in 8 months either way. A pause. Longer than her usual pauses. I'll review the additional items, she said. Don't assume approval. She went back to the elevator. The rest of that first Thursday was a masterclass in what it meant to be in a building that was in trouble. He found the things he had listed on the legal pad, and he found 3 more things that were not on the list because they were not on the east wall and he had not been asked to look for them there. A junction box on the 2nd floor that had been wired without a proper ground. Somebody had done the rough-in quickly and without checking. A section of the 3rd floor subfloor that resonated differently when he walked over it, a hollow sound underneath, which meant either a moisture issue in the joists below or something worse. And on the 4th floor, the northeast corner, a window whose sash had been painted shut, not the original paint, a renovation-era paint job, someone covering a problem rather than addressing it. The glass in that window was single pane where the others had been replaced with double. Whoever had been managing the renovation had either run out of budget or out of attention, and had painted the sash shut to prevent anyone from noticing the draft. He noted all 3 in the supplementary section of the report. He was back the following Tuesday with the as-built drawings Theo had provided. Partial as-built drawings for a building mid-renovation were always partial, and he spent the morning reconciling the drawings to what was actually in the walls and floors and ceilings. The drawings were wrong in 11 places. Not wrong in the way that made the building dangerous. Wrong in the way that made the drawings useless as a management tool, which was its own kind of problem. You couldn't manage a renovation from a drawing that didn't reflect the building, because the drawing was the record, and the record was how you made decisions, and the decisions were how you spent money. He rebuilt the drawings from scratch. He used the originals as a reference, and walked every floor with a tape measure and a pencil, and corrected every discrepancy, and produced a new set of his builds that reflected what was actually there. It took 3 days. He invoiced for 2 of them and wrote the 3rd off as a professional courtesy to himself. Theo, when he saw the revised drawings, said, These are better than what we had. They're accurate, Caleb said. That's different. The previous contractor gave us drawings. I know. I looked at them. Theo looked at the new drawings for a moment. I'll log these as the current as-built. Yes, Caleb said, do that. The building, in the 2nd week, began to communicate in the way buildings communicated to people who were paying attention. The freight elevator told him about the brush wear through the quality of the sound it made on the ascent to 4, a slight grinding undertone that appeared at the same point in every trip, which meant the wear was at a specific position on the shaft. The 2nd floor subfloor told him about the moisture issue through the way the boards gave under his weight at the northwest corner. Not structural, not dangerous, but the beginning of a problem that would be structural if left alone. The fourth-floor window told him about the single pane glass through the temperature differential. He felt 6 inches from the frame on a 20-degree morning, a cold draft that the double-pane windows on either side of it didn't produce. He fixed all 3 before he put them in the report. Then he put them in the report. It was in the second week that he understood what the building had actually been, before the renovation stopped. He found, in the basement utility space, a metal cabinet containing rolled photographs, documentation photographs from the 1980s, a few years before the building had been decommissioned as a textile facility. They showed the factory floor in operation, the looms, the light from the east windows, the particular quality of the ceiling height at full use, before any of the subdivisions and drop ceilings of the years between. It was a beautiful building. Had been, before everything that had happened to it since. He left the photographs in the cabinet, but he thought about them when he was working, about what the building had been, and what it was trying to get back to, and the nature of the work he was doing as something more like restoration than renovation, returning something to what it had been, which was different from making it into something it wasn't, and harder to do, but worth doing when the thing you were returning to had been worth something. This building had been worth something. He could feel it in the 1928 concrete that had held for nearly 100 years and was going to hold for 100 more if you gave it the right sealant on the windows. He gave it the right sealant on the windows. He went back to measuring. That was how it started. Not with warmth, not with welcome, with a window frame and a legal pad and the simple, durable fact that Caleb Dorsey noticed things other people had walked past and did not require acknowledgement for having noticed them. The first month was an education in what a person could take. Renata Cole had a system for contractors, and it was not designed to be comfortable. Every morning at 8, Theo received a list of questions about the previous day's work. Not requests for updates, not general inquiries, but specific questions with right and wrong answers embedded in them. Did the sealant used on the north window bay meet ASTM C920 Class 50 specification? And who had verified it before application? What was the cure time noted on the product label versus the cure time allowed before the temporary scaffolding was reinstated? Where was the second pallet of backer rod material? Because it appeared on the delivery invoice, but was not present in the current materials log. The first week, Caleb answered the questions through Theo. He answered the ones he knew precisely and escalated the ones he didn't, because the only thing worse than not knowing an answer was inventing one. He documented both categories in writing so there was a record. He could feel Theo watching him process each morning's questions with something between sympathy and scientific interest. The way you watch a person try a thing that has ended badly for others. He kept going. By the second week, Renata had added a new category of question, the kind that required not just factual accuracy, but sequential logic. What was the reason the third-floor corridor patch was scheduled before the second-floor patch, and what would the weather window need to look like for the sequence to hold? He answered that one with a 3-paragraph explanation that included a contingency branch for rain delay. She sent back, through Theo, a single word: acceptable. In the third week, she stopped sending the questions through Theo. She sent them directly. His personal email, which he'd put on his first invoice. The messages were short, specific, no preamble or closing. The kind of professional communication that had been stripped of everything, not essential to its function. He answered them the same way. It was, in its way, the most functional working relationship he'd had in years. Not because it was warm, but because there was no performance required. She didn't need him to be reassuring or confident or any particular version of himself. She needed him to be accurate. He found he could be accurate. The building was, underneath its problems, extraordinary. He found himself caring about it the way he cared about engines. Not sentiment exactly, not the aesthetic appreciation of someone who thought about buildings as beautiful objects, but the particular satisfaction of a thing that had been made with intention, that wanted to work. That was being kept from working by accumulated neglect and the wrong decisions made by the wrong people. The freight elevator's motor brushes were worn to near nothing. He replaced the brush assembly in an afternoon, and the elevator stopped sounding like it was in pain. The fire suppression system in the east corridor had a pressure differential that nobody had flagged because the previous contractors hadn't known what to look for, He found it in the second week, and it took 3 days to trace and correct. The concrete floors beneath the polished section in the lobby were in better shape than anyone had assessed. Original 1928 pour, dense and intact, which meant the floor plan's ambitions for the upper levels were achievable. He logged all of it. He sent the logs to Renata. She approved the work. She did not compliment it. What she did, on occasion, was note a specific outcome. The fire suppression system's pressure was now within spec on every floor. The materials cost for the window resealing had come in 8% under his own projection, in the same tone she used for everything else. The tone that made observations sound like entries in a ledger. He understood after a while that this was her version of acknowledgement. He understood it was substantial. He was in the 5th week, rewiring the lobby lighting grid, when she came off the elevator and stood 4 feet behind him and watched without speaking. He knew she was there. She had a specific peripheral presence, a quality of focused attention that had a different texture than the building's ordinary silence, and he kept working. 4 minutes passed, maybe 5. You've centered the grid on the structural midpoint, she said, not the aesthetic midpoint. Yes, the drawings show the aesthetic placement, 8 inches east of where you've put it. I know. If I center on the aesthetic midpoint, I need a bulkhead to hide the junction boxes. The bulkhead drops the ceiling height here by 4 feet. You lose the proportions and the visual height for 8 inches of symmetry. She was still for a long moment, looking at the grid, at the ceiling above it, at the light quality that was already demonstrating the argument. You didn't come to me with this before you started. The drawings were wrong. I fixed them. You could have asked. I could have. He kept working. The bulkhead would have been wrong, and we both would have known it. A pause that lasted long enough for him to run a full conduit section and confirm the connection. Proceed as you have it, she said. He proceeded. It was the 6th week when he noticed the thing he didn't speak about to anyone. He was on his back beneath the freight elevator's motor housing, replacing the brush assembly for the 2nd time. The first replacement had revealed a secondary wear issue in the motor shaft that needed shimming when Renata came through the utility corridor. It was an unusual route. The passenger elevator had been taken out of service for 2 days for a hydraulic inspection, and the utility corridor was the only ground floor path from the materials bay to the main building without using stairs. The corridor had a transition point where the original concrete utility floor met the rubber safety matting he had installed in week 3. There was a slight raised edge at the transition, less than a centimeter. He had flagged it in his assessment notes as something to address when the primary work was done, because the matting's compression set would reduce it to near nothing in a few weeks. He had not gotten to it yet. Renata came through the transition at normal speed, and the chair caught the edge and lurched. A small, controlled thing, corrected in under a second. But in the half-second before the correction, her right foot, the right foot on the footrest, moved. Not a repositioning, not the weight shift of a correction. A flexion, brief and precise and immediately still. A reflex. She had not seemed to notice. He lay under the motor housing and watched the ceiling and did not say anything. He was a mechanic. He knew nothing about spinal injuries or nerve function or what a foot movement meant in that context. What he knew was that it was something he had seen, and that it was different from nothing, and that it was not his to speak about. He filed it in the part of his mind that keeps records, in the section reserved for things that mattered but didn't yet have a category. The week after the threshold incident, he started noticing other things, not dramatic things, not a second incident, nothing repeated. Subtler than that. The quality of her attention in the mornings when she reviewed the overnight reports, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands on the days the weather changed sharply, when the temperature dropped fast and the barometric pressure swung. He was not a medical person, and he did not assign meaning to any of it. He simply noted the days she held the cup differently were cold days, and cold days were when his own knees, bad since a fall from a scaffold at 24, registered in a way the warm ones didn't. He thought about the 14%. He thought about what it meant to carry a number like that inside a building you were trying to hold together by will alone. He had his own version of a number, a doctor in the EQ waiting room 19 months ago, and he had learned that percentages were not the same as predictions. They were just the honest inventory of what anyone knew at that specific moment. He bought the correct backer rod material and sealed the floor transition in the utility corridor that same week. He moved it up in the schedule without mentioning why. In the second month, the building began to change the way it responded to him. This was not something he could explain to anyone, but contractors knew it. The point at which a building shifted from being a collection of problems into being a coherent thing you were in conversation with. The Third and Vine building reached that point around week 7. He knew where the freight elevator hesitated on the way up to 3. He knew which windows in the northeast corner were going to need a second ceiling pass when the temperature dropped below 20. He knew the particular sound the HVAC made on the second floor when the zone damper needed adjustment, a low harmonic in the morning before the system came to full temperature, and he had learned to hear it before it became a problem. He started keeping a separate log for the things the building told him that weren't in any inspection scope. Renata found the log one Thursday when she was reviewing his weekly materials report. She read through it, not the main report, the supplementary pages at the back, and she didn't say anything about it that day. The next morning, the questions she sent included 3 drawn directly from the supplementary log. Not references, not citations, just questions whose answers required understanding the things he'd observed. He answered them. She never acknowledged that the log existed. But the questions kept coming from it, week after week, and that was its own kind of acknowledgement. In the 9th week, a contractor named Beck, who had been sporadically reliable on the second floor, rough in work, made a decision without authorization. He substituted a lower-grade electrical conduit on a 12-foot run in the east corridor. The correct product was back-ordered 3 days, and Beck had decided, apparently, that the grade difference wouldn't be noticed. The difference was small. The specs were clear. Caleb caught it on the Tuesday afternoon inspection, pulled the run himself that evening, and submitted a materials variance report to Renata with the documentation of the substitution, the spec the work should have met, the cost difference, and a note that Beck had not been authorized to make the change. Renata's response came at 7 the following morning. 4 sentences. The variance was noted. The correct material was approved for expedited order. Beck's contract was terminated. The note at the end, you were right to pull it yourself rather than leave it. Beck was gone before noon. Caleb didn't replace him. He had, by the 9th week, a clear enough picture of what remained that he could map it onto his own schedule with reasonable accuracy. The building didn't need another contractor. It needed to be finished by someone who understood it. He worked longer hours. He didn't invoice for them. At the end of the week, Renata sent an email that said, "Your hours this week don't match the log entries. Revise the invoice upward." The weeks that followed had a texture he could describe only as accumulation. Not drama. Nothing dramatic happened in those weeks. Nothing that would make a good story told quickly. It was the smaller, denser thing that happens when a person shows up in the same place every day and refuses to be managed out. There was the Monday in the 8th week when the city inspector did an unscheduled walkthrough, a routine check, the kind that happened to all active permit sites. And Caleb walked him through the building for 40 minutes, and the inspector found nothing to flag and commented, in the parking lot afterward, that this was the cleanest active permit site he had visited in the Third and Vine. Corridor in 2 years. Caleb wrote that in his daily log because it was a fact, and facts belonged in the log. He also wrote it because he had learned in the past 3 weeks that Renata Cole was building a parallel record, and that a parallel record was most useful when the primary record was complete enough to make comparison embarrassing. There was the afternoon Renata appeared on the second floor while he was running conduit in the east corridor and stood at the far end of the hallway looking at the work he had done on the window frames. All of them, not just the one in the lobby, the full sequence along the east face. "You did all of them," she said. The brief was east wall intrusion points. "These are on the east wall." The brief specified ground and second floor. The third floor frames showed the same failure pattern, different degree. "I did those too." She looked at the frames. At the quality of the repair, the backer rod properly seated, the sealant tooled correctly, the surface flush with the brick face. Not rushed. Not adequate. Done the way you would do something if the building were yours and you intended to be in it for a long time. These weren't invoiced, she said. Not yet. Invoice them. I will. She went back down the corridor without another word. But he heard, from the freight elevator, a sound he had not heard from her before. Brief, controlled, but unmistakably the sound of a person who has just been given something they did not expect and is deciding what to do with it. There was the evening in the 10th week when he stayed past 7 finishing the third-floor corridor patch before a rain window closed, and when he finally locked the site and drove to Mrs. Petrocelli's. Maisie was asleep on the couch with a book open on her chest, and Mrs. Petrocelli was watching the news with the sound low, and she looked at him when he came in and said, in the tone of someone who had formed an opinion, "This job is different." "Yes," he said. "Good different," she said. He picked up Maisie, who stirred and then settled against his shoulder without waking, and he carried her to the truck. He sat in the parking lane for a moment before he started the engine, with his daughter asleep against him and the city around them in the ordinary dark of a November evening, and he thought about what Mrs. Petrocelli had said. Good different. Yes, he started the engine. He drove home. The Saturday of the 11th week was the first time Maisie met Renata directly, in the sense of a conversation that had length and continuity, and something at the end of it that was different from the beginning. Caleb had brought her to the building because Mrs. Petrocelli had a rotary breakfast, and there was nowhere else, and Maisie had settled in the lobby with the phantom toll booth and her lantern and the brass compass, which she had taken to carrying in her coat pocket as a daily object rather than keeping in the drawer at home. She carried it the way some kids carried a stone or a shell, not as a talisman exactly, but as ballast. Something true in a pocket. Renata came off the elevator at 9:15 and found the lobby occupied. She looked at Maisie with the expression she brought to unexpected variables. Not hostile, not warm, fully attentive. "You're back," she said. "You remembered me," Maisie said. She said it as a statement of fact, not a question, the way she received things that pleased her. "Yes, my dad says you know every part of every building." Renata looked at Caleb, who was at the other end of the lobby pretending to review his schedule. "Your father says things he knows will be repeated," she said. "Is it true, though?" A pause. "Most of the parts," Renata said. Maisie considered this. "There are 7 buildings? 7 with deferred maintenance. More than that total." "How many total?" 419. Maisie's eyes went somewhere for a second. The somewhere she went when she was processing a large number. "That's more than there are kids in my school," she said. "By a lot." "Yes, do you know all of them?" "The important ones. What makes one important?" Another pause. Longer this time, the kind that meant Renata was actually considering the question rather than selecting from pre-existing answers. "The ones that were built well," she said finally. "The ones that are worth the work." Maisie nodded, satisfied. She looked down at her book, then back up. "Is this one important?" "Yes," Renata said. "This one especially." Maisie went back to the phantom toll booth. Caleb looked at the back of Renata's head as she turned toward the elevator. He thought about the 419. He thought about the ones that were built well, the ones that were worth the work. He thought about what it meant to manage 419 buildings and know, among all of them, which were the important ones. He went back to the schedule. He revised it upward. That same week, the child care arrangement fell through. Mrs. Petrocelli was 63 and had a daughter in Columbus who had just had her first baby. And she left on a Wednesday with a week's notice and genuine apologies and a container of baked ziti for Caleb's freezer. He had backup arrangements in theory. In practice, the backup was another parent from Maisie's school who had a work schedule change, and the backup to the backup was a center on the west side with a 2-week wait. He didn't have money for the bridging care that cost $65 a day, so Maisie came to the building after school. He told her the 3 rules. Stay out of people's way, don't touch anything marked with tape, and if an adult tells her to go somewhere, she goes without argument. He bought her a new library book and a bag of goldfish crackers and a small battery lantern for the corners that weren't yet wired. And she installed herself in whatever room he was working in with her backpack and her books and did her homework with the focused contentment of a child who had been raised in a workshop and found the smell of sawdust and metal comfortable. She was extraordinarily good at being invisible when she chose to be. She chose to be invisible right up until the Thursday afternoon, when Renata came off the passenger elevator and found a 7-year-old sitting in the center of the lobby floor with Charlotte's Web open in her lap and a small brass compass laid across the open page like a bookmark. Caleb was on the other side of the plywood partition. He heard the elevator and then heard the kind of silence that meant something unexpected had happened, and he came around the partition to find his daughter looking up at the woman in the motorized wheelchair with the bright, uncomplicated interest she brought to everything new. "I'm sorry," he said, moving toward Maisie. "Maisie, grab your she's not in the way," Renata said. "Not warm." A statement of fact. But she was looking at Maisie with an expression Caleb hadn't seen on her before. Not the thoroughness she brought to invoices and wall assessments, but something quieter. Something that didn't have a task attached to it. Maisie, who had inherited her mother's complete immunity to the moods of adults she found interesting, said, "Your chair is very fast." "It is. Does it go fast outside too, or just in here?" "Outside too." "Do you go fast on purpose? Or does it just go like that?" A pause. Something in Renata's face moved through what might, in someone more practiced at it, have become a smile. "On purpose," she said. "I thought so," Maisie said, with the satisfaction of a confirmed theory. She picked up the compass. "This is my mom's compass. It always points the right way." Renata looked at the compass, at the small hands holding it. "That's what compasses do," she said, carefully. "I know," Maisie said, "but this one does it better." She put the compass back on her page and returned to Charlotte's Web. Renata looked at Caleb, not with displeasure, with the expression of someone who has encountered a variable that doesn't fit the existing model of the room. "Thursday assessments," she said, the familiar return to business. "Coming," he said. Maisie came to the building 3 more times that month. Each time Renata passed through. Each time there was a brief conversation about the crane outside that Maisie had been tracking by company markings across 2 visits, about the plot of Charlotte's Web, about whether the lobby ceiling height was the tallest she'd ever seen in a building. Renata answered all of it with the same directness she brought to everything. No adjustment of register for the audience. No performance of child-friendliness. Maisie responded to this exactly as Caleb might have predicted, which was with increasing interest and the particular trust she extended to adults who didn't talk down to her. In the 7th week, there was an incident at the loading dock. The delivery driver arrived with a pallet of specialty brick for the east face repair work. He'd been to the site twice before with incorrect paperwork, and his patience had run to empty. Renata had come down to authorize the delivery in person because Theo was out sick. The driver made a comment, just under his breath, just past deniable, about not being paid to wait for somebody who moved slow. Caleb heard it from across the loading dock. He was down the ladder before he'd consciously decided to move. He positioned himself where the driver had to look at him and said, without raising his voice, "Her name is Miss Cole. She holds the contract on this delivery and every delivery your company brings to this site for the next 8 months. The paperwork issues on the first 2 attempts were on your end." He held the man's gaze. "If you want to keep the account, that's how this goes. If you don't, I'll take the return slip." The driver processed the delivery. He left. Caleb went back to his ladder. He was on the 3rd rung when Renata said, behind him at the usual distance, "You didn't need to do that." "I know. I manage it myself. I know you do." He kept climbing. "That's not the same thing as it being right." She didn't answer. But she stayed on the loading dock for 2 or 3 minutes longer than the delivery required, and when she moved past him later that afternoon, there was something different in her posture. Not loose. Renata Cole did not do loose, but slightly less braced than it usually was. Like someone who had, for a brief moment, stopped carrying the weight of preparing for the next blow. The threat had a name and a corner office 12 floors above them. Derek Cole was 51, 3 inches taller than his sister, and he wore the particular confidence of a man who had always expected to inherit the thing that someone else was running. He had been the board chair of Cole Properties for 6 years, since before the accident. Before Renata had taken the CEO role from their father at 34 and built the portfolio into something that Derek's management approach would never have produced. He had not, in anyone's honest reading of the history, forgiven her for it. He'd spent his father's last 2 years positioning for the succession, Had written, Theo said, an actual transition plan. Had already identified the corner office he planned to move into. And then Renata had come back from a year in Singapore running a regional expansion project with results that made her the obvious choice, and their father had named her without much drama, and Derek had smiled in the announcement meeting and started building a different kind of plan. He was 12 signatures away from a board petition to force a medical review of Renata's fitness to continue as CEO. Caleb learned this from Theo in the way he learned most things about Cole Properties' internal situation, incidentally, in the margins of conversations about permits and delivery schedules. Theo had been with the company for 4 years and had the loyalty of someone who understood. With clarity, which sibling was the better one. He's been building the case for 3 years, Theo said. Every quarterly report that underperformed, every delayed permit, every contractor who quit, he logs it. He has a binder, an actual physical binder, what's in the petition. That the accident compromised her executive function, that the delays here, the contractor turnover, it's a pattern of impaired management judgment. He has a physician chosen ahead of time. The review is designed to produce a specific outcome. Caleb was standing in the lobby, looking at the lighting grid. At the grid that was centered on the structural midpoint, at the junction boxes invisible in the joist bays, at the ceiling height that was exactly right, because nobody had built a bulkhead to save 8 inches of symmetry. How many does he need? 19 to file. He has 12 as of yesterday. He's been running out the clock, waiting for this building to still be unfinished at 12 weeks. The building was going to reach certificate of occupancy in 2 weeks. The week after Derek's site visit, something shifted in the building's administrative atmosphere. There were no new confrontations, no second visit, no immediate escalation. What there was, instead, was a quality of attention from the board level that had not been there before, an extra documentation layer in every approval request, a slight lengthening of response times on permits, a formal request through legal for copies of the materials logs for the preceding 6 weeks. Renata mentioned it once. On a Thursday when Caleb was delivering the weekly assessment, that Derek's next move would be paper rather than presents. He's building a parallel record, she said. Something he can set next to ours and find a discrepancy. He won't find one, Caleb said. I know that. She paused. I want you to know that I know that. He looked at her for a moment. It was, from Renata Cole, a significant thing to say. In the week after Derek's visit, Caleb began a parallel documentation system. Not secret, not hidden. He put it in the weekly report, noted it explicitly, a photographic record of all completed work, time-stamped, with the relevant specification noted beside each image. Not because the work was in doubt, because documentation, done right, was its own kind of argument. And he intended to make that argument so thoroughly that there was no gap in it large enough to fit a complaint. Theo saw the photos folder on the shared drive one afternoon and said, Is this because of Derek? It's because completed work should be documented, Caleb said. Theo nodded slowly. Right, he said. Yes, the folder grew. By the end of week 10, it contained 341 images. On a Tuesday in the 11th week, Renata had a call with her attorney that lasted 90 minutes. Caleb knew about it, because it happened in the side office while he was working in the second-floor corridor, and the side office door was open. And he could hear the quality of the conversation, not the words, the register. The register of someone who is preparing a defense that should not need to exist. When the call ended, he heard the elevator. He heard her go up to the 4th floor. He finished the conduit run he was on. He cleaned up the section. He put the tools back in sequence. Then he went up to the 4th floor. She was at the northeast window, looking at the city. The bench wasn't there yet, he was still building it, but she was standing in the corner where it was going to go, in the light that came through the restored glass, with her hands in her lap and the particular stillness she carried. He didn't say anything. He looked at the window frame, the northeast one, the last of the series he'd repaired. The one where the morning light caught the sealant joint and made it look almost intentional, almost decorative, the way a good repair sometimes looked when the light hit it right. How's the petition timeline, he said. 12 days before he can file. Certificate of occupancy is in 9 days. I know. a long quiet. The city below. The river at the edge of the view. He's going to find something, she said. Not about the building. Something else. He's been working the board members who have personal reasons to question my judgment, not professional ones. Sylvia Marsh. Ted Barroway. The ones who were close to my father and who translate concern into votes without meaning to be harmful. Can the attorney counter that? We're filing the groundwork announcement the morning he files the petition. The timing is intentional. He looked at her profile. The way she held the plan in her head along with everything else. The building, the fund, the attorneys, the board, the physician she hadn't called yet. The weight of it was something he recognized. He had carried a smaller version of the same weight for 19 months. The math that didn't work, the contracts that slipped, the question of what came next that never had a clean answer. What he knew from carrying that weight was that there was a point where it became easier, not because the weight got lighter, because you got better at carrying it, and better still when you were not carrying it entirely alone. The building will be done, he said. Whatever he tries to attach to it, the building will be done right. That part is settled. She looked at the view for a long moment. Yes, she said. That part is settled. He went back downstairs. He finished the day. He went back to work. That evening, on the kitchen table after Maisie was asleep, he looked up Cole properties in the public records. It was not complicated reading. Renata's father had built the company on Cincinnati real estate, commercial, mixed use, historic industrial, starting in the 80s. Methodically in the way of a man who understood that land was patient. Renata had taken the portfolio and nearly doubled its value in 4 years as CEO, primarily through accessible commercial development and a federal grant pipeline that the board's old guard had never thought to pursue. Not because they were against it, but because nobody had looked. The company was healthy. By any metric Derek was willing to name in a public filing. The company was healthier than it had been when Renata took it. But there was the accident. And there was the chair. And there was the fact that Derek Cole had a binder. On Tuesday of the following week, Derek came to 3rd and Vine. He arrived with a man named Martin, who carried a clipboard and had the practiced manner of someone whose job was to produce documentation that supported a predetermined conclusion. No advance notice. 10 in the morning. Caleb heard voices in the lobby that didn't belong to Theo and came down from the 2nd floor to find Derek standing in the center of the space, looking up at the lighting grid. He was the kind of handsome that required maintenance, a face that had been good-looking at 30 and now needed effort to hold its shape, kept together by the infrastructure of a man who had always been told he was impressive. He looked at the grid for a long moment with the expression of a person who had come expecting to find a deficiency and had walked into a space that was going to make that difficult. Nice work on the ceiling, he said, to no one specifically. Thank you, Caleb said from the base of the stairs. Derek looked at him with the assessment of someone mapping a room. And you are? Caleb Dorsey, maintenance and renovation coordinator. How long on site? 9 weeks. Derek nodded, filing it. His associate Martin was making notes with a pen. I'm here for a progress review on behalf of the board, Derek said. Ms. Cole is expecting me. She was not, as became clear 40 seconds later when the passenger elevator opened and Renata came into the lobby and the absolute stillness that was her ordinary register was replaced, for a fraction of a second, by something tight. Derek. Her voice was neutral. You have a 30-day notice requirement for unscheduled site visits. The board suspended the clause for executive reviews last quarter. You were in the meeting. The suspension applied to financial audits. She said it without raising her voice, the way she stated specifications, not physical site reviews. You can ask legal to confirm the interpretation. Derek smiled the smile that wasn't warm behind the eyes. We can have that conversation. In the meantime, Martin and I will take 45 minutes. Caleb, you can walk us through the progress. Renata held Derek's gaze for a moment. Caleb will accompany you, she said. I'll be in the site office. She looked at Caleb for just a second, just long enough. He walked them through every floor. It was 45 minutes of a man trying to find deficiencies in work that had been done correctly. Derek asked questions about the window sealant spec, the fire suppression system, the brick-mortar mix, the electrical grid. He asked several questions about the electrical work that became increasingly technical until it was evident he was outside his actual knowledge base. And Caleb answered all of them with the same completeness, the same precision, the same absence of the slight superiority the answers warranted. At the end, in the lobby, Derek said, "This is better than I expected. The building's good. It wants to work." Derek looked at him with the particular assessment of a man deciding whether a piece on the board is going to be a problem. "How long are you contracted through?" "That's a question for Miss Cole." Derek smiled again. "Right." He looked at Martin. "We're done here." After they left, Caleb went to the site office. Renata was at her desk, looking at nothing specific, the way a person looks when they're running a calculation. "He found nothing," she said without looking up. "No, he'll come back," with a more targeted approach. "Yes," she was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was thinking. 12 signatures. He needs 7 more. He has been working the board for 6 months with a version of this story, that the building is evidence, that the contractor turnover is evidence, that I cannot manage a renovation without it running over time and budget. He has been right about the previous contractors. He won't be right about this one. Caleb stood in the doorway. "What's the counter?" "There are counters. The strongest is strategic expansion, an initiative with enough visibility and board value that any member who votes for the medical review has to defend that vote against what they'd be disrupting." She looked up from the screen. "I have been developing a concept for the past 4 months. A neighborhood revitalization fund, below-market accessible commercial leases, infrastructure build-out, a partnership with the city on the historic tax credit program that no one at Cole Properties has applied for in 12 years. I have the financial model. What I don't have is an operations partner who understands construction, building systems, and community-level relationships in the corridors I'm targeting." She looked at him with the full directness that was the only mode he'd seen from her. "I'm not offering this as charity," she said. "A paid partnership role. Equity interest if the fund reaches viability. I'm asking because you understand this building, because you've worked without requiring management, and because I think you understand what this kind of work is for." She waited. He thought about Mrs. Petrocelli's kitchen, which Maisie loved. He thought about the kitchen table and the math that hadn't worked out for 19 months. He thought about the ceiling above him, exactly the right height. "Tell me about the financial model," he said. They were in the site office for 2 hours. The week after Derek's site visit, something changed in the building's atmosphere. There were no new confrontations, no second visit, no immediate escalation. What there was instead was a quality of attention from the board level that hadn't been there before. An extra layer of documentation in every approval request. A subtle lengthening of response times on permits. A request through legal for copies of the materials logs for the preceding 6 weeks. Renata mentioned it once, in passing, on a Thursday when Caleb was delivering the weekly assessment, that Derek's next move would be paper, rather than presence. "He's building a parallel record," she said. "Something he can set next to ours and find a discrepancy." "He won't find one," Caleb said. "I know that." She paused. "I want you to know that I know that." He looked at her for a moment. It was, from Renata Cole, a significant thing to say. 3 days after the visit, Martin filed the deficiency report with the city permits office. 3 items, minor, precisely selected, the kind that existed in the gray zone between a closed issue and a pending one, that required a written response and a follow-up inspection that couldn't delay the certificate of occupancy but would appear in the public record. The first 2 were items Caleb had already resolved and documented. The third was a misreading of the fire suppression pressure specification. Martin had compared the observed pressure to the wrong standard in the code section. Caleb wrote the rebuttal at the kitchen table that night, after Maisie was asleep, with the code section open on his laptop and the original inspection documentation spread across the table. He wrote it precisely, without heat, the way you write something that doesn't need emotion to make its point because the facts are sufficient. He cited the correct code section, the observed pressure readings, the date of the inspection that had confirmed the system was in spec, and the page and line number in Martin's report where the misapplication of the standard occurred. He sent it to Renata at 11:45. She sent back 1 line at midnight. Accurate. Filing in the morning. He went to bed. The rebuttal was accepted by the permits office in 4 days. The deficiency report was closed. Derek had a notation in the public record and an explanatory footnote below it that made the notation's origins fairly clear to anyone who read carefully. It was 3 weeks after that, on a Saturday morning when the building was otherwise empty, that the confession happened. He had learned by then that Renata came to the building on Saturdays without Theo, without the associate contractors, without the structure of a workday. He had begun, without acknowledging it, to be there on Saturday mornings too, not for any particular task, but because there was always something, and because the building's weekend quiet was a different thing than the weekday quiet. They had been on the 4th floor. He was finalizing the window bay alignment on the northeast corner when she stopped and looked at the city through the restored glass. Cincinnati spread out below them. 3rd Street, the old viaduct, the river just visible at the edge of the horizon. She looked at it for long enough that he understood this was not a pause in a conversation about to start. "I used to come up here before the accident," she said. "This floor was storage. I came up when I needed to think and didn't want to be found." He was quiet. "I was standing on the mezzanine of a building in Anderson Township. A walk-through, same as 100 others. The railing had been incorrectly reinstalled after an HVAC retrofit, 6 screws where there should have been 12, wrong gauge. Corroded at 2 connection points. I put my hand on it and it gave, and I went down 1 full story." She said it in the same tone she used for deficiency reports. The surgeon said the probability of meaningful recovery was around 14%. I've seen 4 specialists since then, all consistent with that assessment. Caleb looked at the city below. 14% isn't 0. "No," she said. "It isn't." A long pause. "I have not," she said carefully, "been entirely honest with my physicians about certain things I've noticed. Intermittent things. Small, I haven't reported them because reporting them creates documentation. Documentation is what Derek needs." She stopped. "That is not the only reason. The other reason is that I've been afraid of what it means either way. If it's nothing, nerve noise, then I've spent weeks believing in something that isn't real. If it's something," she stopped again. "If it's something," he said quietly, "it's something worth knowing." She looked at the river. "Yes," she said, after a moment. He did not press. He did not say, "I saw it." He did not know yet whether that was the right thing to offer, or whether it was something she needed to arrive at on her own terms and her own time, which was how she arrived at everything that mattered. "The northeast corner is going to get an hour of direct morning light from October through April," he said. "The bench will be ready this week." She looked at the corner, at the light that was already doing what he'd described. "Good," she said. He went home that Saturday and sat at the kitchen table and thought about 14%. He was not a person who had ever been comfortable with probability as a substitute for certainty. Mechanics tended that way, tended toward wanting to know the answer rather than the distribution of possible answers. But he had spent 19 months learning to live inside uncertainty, had learned that the question "what happens next" had no reliable answer, and that asking it was less useful than asking "what do I do today?" He had learned that lesson from Maisie, who at 5.5 had demonstrated a complete lack of interest in the unanswerable version of the question, and a complete willingness to be entirely in the answerable one. What Dana would have said, he thought, was, 14% is 14% more than 0, which is all any of us have any guarantee of. She would have said it without drama, the way she said things that were true, and then she would have made tea and moved on. He made tea. He moved on. The following Thursday, Renata sent him a message that was different from the usual Thursday messages. Not a question about materials or sequences or specifications. A message that said, "I looked up the building in Anderson Township. The inspection records for the HVAC retrofit. The contractor who reinstalled the railing incorrectly was cited for 3 violations on that project and 2 others in the preceding 2 years. There was no enforcement action. I have been advised not to pursue it further for legal reasons. I wanted you to know that I know it was not a random failure. It was a preventable failure." He read the message twice. He wrote back, "I know. I could tell from how you looked at railings the first month." A long pause. Then, "You notice a great deal." He wrote, "Buildings are mostly railings. Things that are supposed to hold." Another pause. Then nothing. No response. which was its own kind of response. He put his phone away and went back to the northeast window bay, which was almost done, and he thought about railings and what it meant to trust one again after the wrong kind had failed. The building came to certificate of occupancy on a Thursday morning. The inspector, a city employee named Hartley, who Caleb had dealt with 3 times before, and who had the demeanor of a man whose ambitions had been correctly sized for his position, walked every floor, tested every system, ran the suppression check, measured the corridor clearances, verified the add-a-door widths. He found one item, a door threshold on the 3rd floor that was 2 millimeters out of specification. Caleb had the correct hardware in his truck. He installed it in 18 minutes while Hartley stood in the corridor checking something on his phone. Hartley initialed the correction and handed Theo the certificate at 11:47 in the morning. Theo texted Renata. Renata came down to the lobby in the passenger elevator with her laptop under her arm and stopped in the middle of the space that had been, 12 weeks ago, a gutted promise with dangling wires and wrong sealant and a plywood partition where the atrium was supposed to be. The lighting grid lit the lobby with a quality that made the 1928 brick glow. The floors were clean and honest. The plywood partition was gone. The atrium opened beyond it, 22 feet to the ceiling, the industrial light doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Renata stood in the center of it for a moment. She didn't look at the certificate in Theo's hand. She looked at the building. "It's very good," she said. He understood what that meant. "Thank you," he said. They filed the Groundwork Cincinnati partnership papers that afternoon. The structure they'd worked out over 6 weeks of evening emails and 2 Saturday afternoon sessions in the site office, Renata held the capital, the real estate relationships, the company's institutional standing, and the federal grant access that needed a corporate sponsor of Cole Properties standing. Caleb ran operations, construction, contractor vetting, accessible infrastructure design, and the ground-level relationship with the neighborhood organizations. Equity. 70-30 in Renata's favor. Adjusting to 60-40 at viability. His operational salary was a number that did not, for the first time in 19 months, require the kitchen table math. He called Mrs. Petrocelli from the truck that evening. She was coming back in November. Her granddaughter was healthy. She asked about Maisie's reading level, and he said Maisie was reading Charlotte's Web and had opinions about it. Mrs. Petrocelli laughed the way of someone who was already looking forward to hearing them. The day they signed the groundwork papers, Maisie was in the site office corner with the Phantom Toll Booth, a book about a kid who drives through a gate into another place, which she had identified as relevant to her life. She sat through the attorney's visit with the focused patience she brought to adult situations, tracking the room from behind her book. When the attorney had gone and it was the 3 of them, Maisie looked up and said, "Did you do something important?" "Yes," Renata said. "What, we started something?" Maisie thought about this with appropriate gravity. "Is it the kind of thing where you don't know yet if it'll work?" Renata looked at her. "Yes, my dad says those are the best kind," Maisie said. "Because you get to find out." She went back to the Phantom Toll Booth. Caleb watched Renata watch Maisie for 2 or 3 seconds, the expression on Renata's face that she didn't quite catch before it landed on her, the one that had no practiced response beneath it. She looked up and found him watching. She looked back at the papers on the table. "We should set up the operations workspace," she said. "Yes," he said. The Walnut Hills property was a different kind of challenge than 3rd and Vine. 3rd and Vine had been a question of restoration, returning a building with good bones to what it had always wanted to be. The Walnut Hills corner store was a question of reinvention. The building was smaller, the bones were less distinguished, and the neighborhood context was more complicated in ways that no financial model fully captured. The 6 partner organizations in the Walnut Hills corridor had been working in that neighborhood for a combined 80 years, and they had opinions about what community development looked like when it was done correctly versus when it was done by people who meant well and got it wrong. Caleb spent 3 weeks in the corridor before they started the permits process. He walked the block every day. He went to the community association meeting a Wednesday evening in the fellowship hall of a church on Reading Road, and he sat in the back and listened. He didn't talk about groundwork or Cole Properties or the corner store project that first night. He talked about what he'd seen that week and what he thought was possible, and what he thought were the questions that deserved better answers than he currently had. The association president was a woman named Loretta, who had been running youth programming in Walnut Hills for 22 years, and who had a finely calibrated radar for people who were going to make things worse while meaning to make them better. She asked him 3 questions. He answered them honestly, including the parts where the honest answer was that he didn't know yet. She came to the corner store the following Saturday with 2 of the other association members and walked the space with him for 2 hours and told him everything that mattered about what the neighborhood needed from that corner. Not what would look good in a grant application, what would actually matter. He rebuilt the interior plan that afternoon. He sent the revised version to Renata with a 3-page explanation of what Loretta had told him and why it changed the layout. Renata read it, approved the revision with one modification to the lease structure that made it more accessible to a food business, which was what Loretta had said the corner most needed, and they signed a letter of intent with the family-owned Guatemalan bakery the following week. The work was different from building restoration, slower and less legible, more variables that no inspection checklist accounted for. But he found he was good at it in the same way he was good at the building work, not because he was charismatic or politically skilled, but because he paid attention to what was actually there rather than what a plan said should be there, and he adjusted accordingly. Renata noticed the difference in the Walnut Hills work and didn't comment on it directly. What she did was add a line to the groundwork operations framework, community relationship assessment prior to permit application, Caleb's discretion on scope and timeline. No approval required. He read the line 3 times before he understood what it meant. It meant she trusted his judgment at the level where she didn't need to see it to approve it. The months between the certificate of occupancy and Derek's petition were, in the accounting of things that mattered, the best months Caleb had had since Dana died. He was aware of this not as a statement he would have made aloud. It wasn't the kind of thing he said aloud, but as a physical fact. The way you become aware of the weight you've been carrying when you put some of it down. Not all of it. Some of it. The specific portion that was the math at the kitchen table, the contracts that might not come through, the question of whether Maisie's school clothes would last another season. That portion? Set down. Mrs. Petrocelli came back in November and immediately identified a change in Maisie that she described as more interested in buildings than she used to be. Maisie had developed, over the fall months of visiting the Third and Vine site, a specific and detailed interest in the way buildings worked, not aesthetically, not the way a child is interested in pretty things, but functionally. She asked Caleb on the drive home one evening how you would know if a building was going to fall down. He explained, as accurately as he could at a level that worked for 7, about the relationship between load-bearing structure and foundation, about the way buildings communicated stress through cracks and settlements, and the places where materials met. She listened with the focused attention she brought to things that interested her. "Did the Third and Vine building ever tell you it was okay?" she asked. "Not in so many words," he said. "But yes." "How?" He thought about it. "The floors, mostly, the way it absorbed the work we did without fighting it. A building that's structurally sound responds to repair differently than one that isn't. It settles. It gets quieter." Maisie thought about this for a moment. "Like a person," she said. "Yes," he said, "like a person." The groundwork operations office was on the 4th floor of the Cole Properties downtown building, 2 doors down from Renata's executive office, which Caleb had been in 3 times before he stopped tracking the number. It was a room that looked the way Renata approached everything. Nothing in it that didn't have a function. The function of each thing immediately evident. A good desk. A whiteboard that was always current. The groundwork map on the wall with the target corridors marked in 3 colors. Proposed, active, completed. The completed column gained its first entry in January. When the Walnut Hills corner store reached its own certificate of occupancy and the family-owned bakery, Panaderia Herrera, which Loretta had identified as the right anchor for the corridor, opened its doors on a Saturday morning to a line that went around the corner and didn't shorten until mid-afternoon. Caleb went with Maisie. Loretta was there, and she shook his hand and said, "You built it right." She said it the way he said things that mattered, without decoration, as a statement of accessible fact. "We did," he said. He sent a photo to Renata. The line going around the corner. The sign in the window. She sent back, first one. Next, he looked at the photo for a moment and then put his phone in his pocket and bought Maisie a concha and stood on the sidewalk in the January light and thought about next. There were 2 more properties in active development. The East End Corridor building that was the most complicated of the 3. An old industrial space that needed a full gut and a structural assessment before it could be permitted, and a smaller building in Avondale that was going faster than expected because the previous owner had done better maintenance than the listing had suggested. He was learning the rhythm of the work, the way community development moved differently from pure building restoration, the way the human variables mattered as much as the structural ones, the way a meeting in a church fellowship hall on a Wednesday night could determine more about a project's eventual value than any site assessment he could run. He was good at this. He had not known that before, because he had never done it before, but he was finding that the skills that made him good at buildings transferred. The patience, the attention to what was actually there rather than what a plan said should be there, the willingness to come back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Loretta at their 3rd meeting had said, "Most people who come in here from outside want to help us. You want to understand us first." That's different. He had thought about that for a long time afterward. In March, he and Renata had a conversation that was different from their other conversations. Not a break from the pattern was still there, the operational precision, the clarity of purpose, but something additional in it. They were in the groundwork office, late afternoon, reviewing the East End permit timeline, and Renata had set down the permit document and looked at the map on the wall for a moment and said, without looking at him, "My father built the first 12 properties in this city by himself. He drove to every site, he knew every building manager by name, he did his own inspections for the first 5 years. He always said the mistake most developers make is they stop touching the buildings." Caleb looked at the map. He would have liked the Walnut Hills building, Renata said, not because of what it is, because of the line on Saturday. The bakery line. Yes, he used to say you could tell if you'd done it right by whether people lined up without being asked. She was still looking at the map. "We did it right." He sat with that for a moment. "Yes," he said. "We did." She picked up the permit document. The conversation returned to the East End timeline. But the thing that had been said was said, and it had a weight that the permits and the schedules and the specifications didn't quite account for, the kind of weight you only get from something that is true and has been acknowledged and can't now be taken back. That was, from Renata Cole, the equivalent of a standing ovation. In April, Derek filed the board petition. 19 signatures. He had been careful and methodical, private dinners with the 3 undecided members, a formal presentation to the risk committee, a letter from his pre-selected physician expressing concern about the adequacy of executive cognitive screening for officers managing assets of this scale. The language was precise, undeniable, and devastating. The petition went in on a Tuesday morning. Renata's attorney filed the Groundwork Cincinnati public launch announcement at 8:15 the same morning. Renata had known Derek's timeline within 48 hours of when he'd said it. Theo had sources she'd never asked him to develop and hadn't asked him about. The launch went to the Cincinnati Business Courier, 2 regional wires, and a list of board members personally. 6 neighborhood organizations had signed letters of intent. The federal historic tax credit application, $4.3 million projected first-year award, was submitted simultaneously. The board read both filings before lunch. 3 of Derek's 19 signatures withdrew within 4 days. A 4th asked for a delay pending the federal application's review. Derek had 15. He needed 16. He went looking for the 16th with the focused efficiency of a man who had come this far. The one he identified was Sylvia Marsh, 62, long-term investor, a woman who had genuinely loved Renata's father, and who had genuine, unmanipulated concern for Renata's well-being that Derek had spent 8 months carefully reshaping into a different kind of concern. Sylvia had the kind of old-fashioned decency that Derek had counted on to work in his favor, because he had framed everything as care, as prudence, as doing right by the company Gerald Cole had built. What he hadn't counted on was that Sylvia would call Renata directly. Renata took the call in the groundwork office, which had moved from the 3rd and Vine side office to a proper space downtown. Caleb was across the table working through the Walnut Hills property assessment when the call came in. He watched Renata's face during the 12-minute conversation, not the content, which he could only half hear, but the quality of it. The way her posture shifted a degree when something surprised her. After she hung up, she sat looking at the table. She asked if I was well, Renata said. Not as a formality. Caleb waited. She asked the way someone asks when they actually want the answer. She paused. I told her about the work. About this. She indicated the table, the groundwork plans, the map of the target corridors on the wall. About why I'm still doing it. What did she say? She said she was going to take more time. Renata was quiet. She won't vote against the petition. She'll abstain. With an abstention, I'm at 15, not 16. The petition fails threshold. He looked at the map. At the 3 corridors, the 6 partner organizations, the properties they'd identified. That's enough, he said. That's enough, she said. The petition was withdrawn on a Wednesday afternoon. Theo's text came in at 4:18. DC filed withdrawal notice an hour ago. 15 of 19. Caleb was at the Walnut Hills site when the text came. He read it. He put his phone in his pocket. He stood in the empty storefront and looked at what it was going to become. He texted back, "Good." That evening, he picked Maisie up and stopped for groceries and let her pick the cereal. In the car, out of the silence, she said, "Is Renata going to be okay? Why are you asking about Renata? She seems like she's been worried about something. On Saturdays especially." He watched the road for a moment. She had a hard thing happen to her. And someone was trying to make it harder. But that part is over now. Maisie processed this in the way she processed things that mattered. Does she know it's over? I'll tell her, he said. The bench was finished on a Saturday in late April. He'd built it over 4 evenings, salvaged maple from a Clifton building that had come down the previous fall, the grain running the long way, finished with a light Danish oil that left the wood honest and warm and would hold up to the morning light coming through that northeast window. The proportions had come to him in the 4th floor space. Not designed so much as understood. Wide enough to look at the river, low enough that the view stayed unobstructed, the legs angled slightly so the whole thing felt like it was leaning toward the glass. He brought it up in sections and assembled it in the corner. Maisie had come with him that Saturday and helped carry the seat section from the elevator, which she treated as an important responsibility, and then went to the opposite end of the floor and began arranging salvage brick samples by color, in a line that she maintained was not a game. Renata arrived at 9. She came straight to the 4th floor without stopping downstairs, and she came to the northeast corner and stopped and looked at the bench. The morning light was doing what it did in that corner in April, warm and direct through the restored glass, the grain of the maple lit from the side in a way that showed the figuring in the wood. The city was below the window in the particular clarity of a cool morning, the river just visible at the edge of the view. She was still for a long time. Caleb stood at a distance and didn't say anything. Then Maisie appeared from the other end of the floor, walking over with the directness of a child who had decided something. She looked at the bench. She looked at Renata. Then she reached into the deep left pocket of her coat, the pocket where she kept the things she kept, and took out the brass compass and held it out toward Renata with both hands. Caleb went very still. Renata looked at the compass, at the small hands offering it. "You can hold it," Maisie said. "It was my mom's. It still points right." Something moved through Renata's face, not a mask coming down, but a different kind of opening. The kind that happens when a person is given something they did not know they needed and has no prepared response for it. She reached out and took the compass and held it in her palm. The needle found north. "Thank you," Renata said to Maisie, very quietly. "You can keep it for today," Maisie said, with the authority of someone who has thought through the terms. "But I need it back." "Of course," Renata said. Maisie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her brick samples. Caleb sat down on the bench. After a moment, Renata brought the chair next to it, and they both looked at the city and the river and the light coming through the glass he'd sealed with the right product 8 months ago on his first Thursday on the job. "She's remarkable," Renata said. "I know." A pause. "She's her mother's daughter. A long quiet. The comfortable kind." "I've made an appointment," Renata said. Careful, building toward it. A new physician, not connected to the board or to Derek. Someone recommended outside the company. He looked at the river. I've been tracking the incident, she said. The right foot. More frequent over the last 6 weeks. The intervals are shortening. She stopped. I don't know what that means. I want someone who will tell me what it means without a prior conclusion. Good, he said. I thought you should know, he said. Whatever it means. She turned the compass over in her palm. The needle moved and settled. I noticed it, he said after a moment. The first time. 6th week. You came through the utility corridor when the passenger lift was down. The floor transition at the rubber matting, your chair caught the edge. Your foot moved. He paused. I didn't say anything. It wasn't mine to. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the compass. No, she said. It wasn't. Another long quiet. I'm glad you didn't quit, she said. Not looking at him. At the compass, at the needle pointing steadily north. He looked at the bench he'd built, at the city below, at his daughter across the floor making order out of salvage brick with the same focused pleasure with which Dana had once made order out of everything she touched. This was the job, he said. I was always going to do the job. The physician's name was Dr. Inara Whitfield, and she took 8 weeks, because 8 weeks was what the assessment required. She reviewed the original imaging and the 3 subsequent assessments first. Then she conducted her own examination over 2 appointments 4 weeks apart, with specific attention to the nerve conduction pathways that the prior assessments had characterized as inactive. She was methodical, and she was not in a hurry. On the morning she called with her findings, Renata was at her desk downtown with the window open, and Cincinnati in the early summer light below. The lesion was incomplete. It had always been incomplete, present in the original imaging, underweighted, because the clinical picture at the time of the injury had been consistent with the complete lesion, and the incomplete finding had been noted and not pursued. An incomplete lesion did not guarantee anything. What it meant, in combination with the nerve activity Dr. Whitfield had documented across 8 weeks, was that the 14% had moved. Moved to what number? Renata said. I want to be careful about attaching a specific figure before a 3rd assessment in another 4 weeks, Doctor, Whitfield said. What I can tell you with confidence is that the activity is organized. It's not noise. The pathway is responding. The direction is not downward. Renata sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after the call ended. She looked at the city below, at the building she managed, at the corridors she had decided were worth investing in, at the corner of 3rd and Vine visible from her angle if she looked between the 2 towers on Main. She called Caleb 6 days later. He was at the Walnut Hills site, on his back under the accessible ramp framing, verifying the anchor bolt pattern against the spec. He answered on the 2nd ring. She told him what Dr. Whitfield had found. The incomplete lesion. The organized activity. The direction is not downward. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Then, what does it mean? Not asking for medical translation, asking what it meant for her. She looked at the city. It means the direction is up, she said. Another quiet. Okay, he said. Good. The Groundwork Cincinnati public launch was in June, at 3rd and Vine. 112 people came. The lobby was filled, the lighting grid doing what it was designed to do, the atrium open, the brick warm, in the evening light. The certificate of occupancy framed and hung near the entrance. Representatives from all 6 neighborhood partner organizations. 2 city council members. The federal program officer who had flown in from Columbus because the application was, she told Renata privately, the best structured first submission she'd reviewed in 3 years. Commercial real estate people who had heard things and come to see if the things were true. Renata spoke for 11 minutes. She described the fund's structure and the neighborhoods and the federal partnership the way she described everything. Without hyperbole, without performance, in the precise language of someone who had done the work and needed nothing else to make the case. The building made the rest of the argument. It stood around them as evidence, what a building was when someone showed up every morning and paid attention and did the work correctly. Derek was there. He had come because not coming would have been noticed by the board members who were there. He stood near the back with Martin and did not speak to Renata, and Renata did not speak to him. He looked at the lobby ceiling twice, at the grid centered on the structural midpoint, at the junction boxes invisible in the joist bays, at the ceiling height that was exactly right, and both times his expression was the expression of a man revising a number downward. At the end of the reception, Sylvia Marsh found Renata near the atrium. She was small and white-haired, and she had the warmth of someone who had spent 60 years deciding what was worth warming to. "Your father would have liked this one," she said. Renata was quiet for a moment. "He would have liked the building," she said. "He would have argued with me about the neighborhood priority order." Sylvia laughed. "The real kind. He absolutely would have. He always thought the East End should go first. He was wrong about the East End. He was frequently wrong in very confident ways." Sylvia smiled, and in the smile was acknowledgement, the recognition of a woman who had watched a succession happen and had made a choice, quietly, about which side of it to stand on. "You built something good here, Renata." Caleb watched Derek leave the building. Derek walked out without looking back, with Martin beside him and the slight forward lean of a man who is recalculating. He had come to a public launch event for an initiative he had spent 9 months trying to prevent. And the initiative had a federal program officer who had flown in from Columbus and 6 neighborhood organizations represented and 2 city council members who had both, in their remarks, specifically thanked Cole Properties by name. He had stood in the back of a lobby that was, by any objective measure, a very good lobby, and he had looked at a lighting grid that was centered on the structural midpoint instead of the aesthetic one and produced light that made century-old brick look like something a museum would have wanted. He walked out. He didn't look back. That was the moment Caleb understood that this particular version of the fight was actually over. Not because Derek had conceded anything, not because he had said anything gracious or honest or different from what he had always been, but because the building had already made the argument he would have had to answer, and it had made it in a room full of people who were now board-level witnesses to what Cole Properties was doing under Renata's leadership, and there was no petition that could survive that particular public record. There would be another version of the fight. Renata had said so, and she was right. But this version was over, and the bench on the 4th floor was part of why it was over, and the Walnut Hills bakery line was part of why it was over, and Loretta saying "you want to understand us first" was part of why it was over. And the backer rod on the east wall, and the correctly torqued motor brushes in the freight elevator, and the 340 one-time stamp photographs in the shared drive were part of why it was over. The work. That was what was over. That was what had won. Theo appeared at Caleb's elbow as the room cleared. He had the expression of someone who had been holding something for a long time and was only now beginning to set it down. 15 signatures, Theo said. He needed 16. I know. That's really over. That version is. Theo nodded. He looked at the lobby, at the grid, at the atrium, at the brick, with the expression of someone who had worked in this building for 8 months and was seeing it as a finished thing for the first time. You built something good here, he said. We did, Caleb said. Theo nodded again. He went to find the caterer. She left shortly after. Maisie had been allowed to come to the launch. She wore the blue dress from Dana's mother in Columbus, the one with the small white buttons at the collar that Maisie had opinions about but had submitted to for the occasion, and she had eaten 2 pieces of brie with the composure of someone handling a professional situation correctly. She was sitting on the polished concrete floor near the base of the lighting grid, doing something with the brass compass, watching the needle. Renata found Caleb collecting the last of the folding chairs. The event noise had faded to the building's quiet. 19 signatures, Caleb said. He needed 19. He had 15. That's over. That version is. She looked at the building around them, at what it had been and what it was now. He'll find another approach. You'll build something better to fight from. She looked at him. Something settled in her posture. The stillness of someone who has decided to stay in the room, permanently, without negotiation. Yes, she said. We will. Maisie looked up from the compass. The needle's pointing at Renata, she announced. Caleb looked at her. That's not how compasses work, Bug. I know how compasses work, Maisie said with dignity. I'm telling you what's happening. Renata looked at the compass, then at Maisie. Something moved across her face, warm and unguarded and real. "May I have it back?" Maisie asked. "Of course." Renata crossed the lobby, the full length of it, to where Maisie was sitting on the floor, and held out the compass. And Maisie took it and put it back in her coat pocket with the satisfaction of something properly returned. Renata looked up from Maisie and found Caleb watching her. She didn't look away. He didn't either. "I was wrong about you," she said, "in the beginning, about what kind of person you were." "You were being careful," he said. "Yes, you didn't need to be careful with me. I know that now." The June light was still strong at 6:30. The city going on outside the way cities do, unhurried by particular days. The building standing in its corner, the freight elevator working, the windows sealed correctly, the grid centered on the midpoint that mattered, the bench on the 4th floor with the river view and the morning light. Maisie stood up and put on her coat. She looked between them with the frank, unhurried assessment of 7 years old. "Are we going home?" she asked. Caleb looked at Renata. "In a minute," he said. "This is not a story about a man who fixed a woman. It is a story about a man who fixed a building, who showed up every morning with a flashlight and a legal pad and the professional ethic of someone who had been taught, early, that you don't walk past a thing that needs doing, who treated a problem as a problem to be solved, a person as a person to be respected, and a commitment as a commitment to be kept, not because he was exceptional, but because he was steady, which turns out to be its own kind of exceptional, in the end. It is a story about a woman who had been hurt, badly, and who had rebuilt herself around the injury so completely that the structure had become load-bearing. She had calibrated her distance to 6 feet in every conversation, had set her standard at the height that ensured most people would fail it, had driven off 11 people in 9 months, not because she was cruel, but because she was correct, and because being correct had been the only thing she trusted. She had been right about most of them. She was wrong about one. The refusal was not Caleb's alone. Renata refused too to believe, after 11 contractors and 9 months and 15 signatures and a physician's 14%, that the direction was only ever downward. She refused the easier story about herself, the story where the accident was the last word and the chair was the whole sentence. She refused to let the distance stay at 6 feet when the person on the other side of it kept showing up with the right sealant and the right answer and no interest in being thanked for it. Maisie's compass points north. It always has. That's not magic, it's physics. The simple and reliable physics of a needle finding what it was made to find. There are people like that. People who locate something true by nature, without trying, who come into a room and find the north of it before anyone else has thought to look. Dana had been like that. Caleb had organized his whole life around following her north, and when she was gone, he had kept moving in the direction she'd pointed him, toward the work, toward Maisie, toward the window frame on the east wall that needed the right product, applied by someone who had taken the time to understand what substrate they were working with. It turns out that was enough. Not because grief ends. It doesn't. But because the compass is still in Maisie's pocket, and it still works. The East End building came to certificate of occupancy in September. It was the hardest of the three. The structural work had taken 6 weeks longer than projected, because the foundation had revealed, in the assessment, a drainage issue that had been hidden under a concrete floor for probably 40 years. And addressing it correctly had required a re-excavation and a waterproofing approach that none of the original permits had anticipated. Caleb had found it on a Tuesday morning and called Renata and told her exactly what it was and exactly what it would cost and exactly how long it would take to do right. She had been quiet for a moment on the phone. Then, how long if we do it wrong? 6 months before it fails. More if we're lucky, less if we're not. How long if we do it right? 6 extra weeks now. Then it holds. Do it right, she said. And that was the conversation. He had done it right. It had taken 6 weeks, and it had held. And the building had come to certificate of occupancy with a foundation that Caleb was willing to put his name on, which was the standard he applied to everything he built. The Avondale building was done by October. 3 properties complete, all within budget, all with community partner tenants signed and operational or in final lease negotiation. The federal program officer, in her third quarter report, had cited Groundwork Cincinnati as a model implementation for the historic tax credit program. The first year of the fund she had written had produced outcomes that typically required 3 to 5 years to achieve. Renata had sent Caleb the report with no note attached. He had sent back, "What's next?" She had sent back the list of the next 6 properties. He had looked at the list for a moment. Then he had printed it and put it on the wall above his desk at home, in the corner of the kitchen where he used to do the math that didn't work out, and he had looked at it for a long moment and thought about the window frame on the east wall of a building on 3rd and Vine, and the legal pad, and the note that said, "I found 6 additional items outside the east wall scope. I've included them because they'll compound." He had always been doing this, he understood. The same job, from the same angle, in whatever building was in front of him. He just hadn't had the right building until now. Dr. Whitfield called on a Tuesday in August with the 3rd assessment. Renata listened to the number in her downtown office, with the window open and the city below in the late summer light. She thanked the doctor. She sat with it for a moment, with the number, with what it meant and what it didn't mean yet, and what the direction of it was. Then she picked up her phone and called Caleb. He was at the East End corridor site, the 3rd groundwork property, the one Renata's father had always believed in, which she had eventually agreed was not a question of priority, but of sequence. And he answered on the second ring. She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment, the silence of a person who is letting something land rather than looking for the next task. "What does it mean?" he said, not asking for the medical translation, asking what it meant, for the next Saturday, for the bench, for the building they'd started, and the one after that, and the one after that.